la participación del doctor Herman Tavani, así que está el decano Jorge Aponte en primera instancia. Decano, si quiere hacer una introducción antes de que inicie la introducción con el doctor Herman. Dr. Herman, let me introduce Jorge Aponte. He is the Dean of the Engineering School. So, Jorge, please.
Thank you, Edward. Good afternoon, Dr. Tavani. It's a pleasure to meet you. Welcome to our faculty at the Militar University. I hope that you enjoyed these 2 hours and for sharing with us the interesting field that you manage. In my particular case, I'm not an expert in ethics and technology. I only know something about technology. So this is gonna be a very nice experience for us. And I am sure that we are enjoying the next 2 hours. Welcome to our university, Doctor. And we would like to see you here maybe in the future to drink a cup of coffee and to share the Colombian culture. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much.
So let me introduce Dr. Herman Tavani. Dr. Herman Tavani is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Rivier University, where he has taught both full and part-time since 1980, while also serving for many years as chair of Philosophy Department and as director of Rivier Liberal Studies Program. Professor Tavani has taught philosophy courses for nearly half a century, teaching his first philosophy class in September 1971 at West Chester University, where he also earned his BA and MA degrees. He has taught at many other colleges and university during his career, including Boston College, Temple University, where he received his doctorate in 1978. He is author of Ethics and Technology, a textbook that is widely used in many countries and currently in its 6th edition. Dr. Tavani has also written, edited, and co-edited 5 other books within in cyber ethics, intellectual property rights in a network world, ethics, computing, and genomics, the Handbook on Information and Computer Ethics, and Elements of Reasoning, a short introduction. His academic publications include more than 100 articles, reviews, and bibliographies that have appeared in numerous scholarly journals, encyclopedias, and books of readings. Professor Tavani, welcome to participate in our Doctoral Symposium. It's an honor to have you here, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say, first of all, good afternoon and greetings from Nashua, New Hampshire, in the United States. I would like to thank Professor Edward again. I apologize if I mispronounced his last name, for inviting me to be with you today. It's indeed an honor to be at your doctoral symposium. I'm very impressed with your doctoral program in applied science. And so,
sorry, Doctor. Edward, can you? Yeah. Sorry, Doctor.
No problem.
The microphone was open, so it generates some noise, but now it's all right. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Now, yes.
Oh, you couldn't hear me from before? Okay, so shall I repeat what shall I just repeat then? Good afternoon and greetings from Nashua, New Hampshire, the United States. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Professor Edward Guillen, I apologize if I mispronounced his last name, for inviting me to be with you today. My regret is I cannot be there in person, but I hope one day to be with you at your university. I apologize. I wish I were fluent in Spanish. I am not, sadly. I've studied French and German, but unfortunately, Spanish, which is the number 2 language in the United States, as you probably know, I am not literate in, so I will proceed in English. I will try to speak slowly, although being of Italian descent, I tend to speak rapidly, but I will try to consciously to do that. And the other thing I would like to say is that this is only my second time on Google Works. I typically use Zoom. So yesterday I just did a practice with Professor Guillen, and I hope this is going to work out. So I'm going to now try to bring up my PowerPoint slides and just see how this is going to work out. Is that working okay? Can you see anything?
It's not transmitting at this
Not coming
moment.
up. Okay, let me try that again. So this may do it.
Yep, it's working.
Okay. And now is it still working?
Yes.
Yeah.
It is?
Yes,
It
it
is.
is working.
Okay, so I can begin?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, good. Okay, so the title of this afternoon's talk is Expanding the Standard Applied Ethics Framework in an Era of Emerging and Converging Technologies. In this talk, I will be drawing from some chapters in my textbook, Ethics and Technology. I'll also be drawing from some concepts and ideas and some other previously published works, which I'll identify at the end. I've been working on this topic for a while and trying to evolve it. So just in terms of my, I should put this in how's that? Yeah. So in terms of the topics I will discuss, I'd like to examine some ethical aspects of converging and emerging technologies and focus on the following questions. What do we mean by the expressions converging technology and emerging technology? And why are their ethical implications often difficult to anticipate? Is the so-called standard ethical framework, which I'll explain later, used to analyze moral issues also adequate for addressing moral concerns in converging and emerging technologies? What are some of the key differences between what I'm going to call ethics last and ethics first approaches to analyzing moral concerns involving recent technologies? How can a dynamic ethics model introduced by James Moore back in 2008 better help us to analyze ethical issues that arise in the context of emerging and converging technologies? Note, I will not argue for a brand new ethical theory, as some have suggested we need to handle the emerging technologies. I argue that we can and that we should expand upon the standard model by incorporating some additional steps and sub-steps into that framework. So we begin with the question, what exactly do we mean by the concepts of convergence and technological convergence? So when we think of convergence, we think of lines coming together, or we think of various points of intersection. But in a technical context in computing and technology, convergence is often defined as the coming together of two different entities, integration of two or more different technologies in a single device or system. The term technological convergence itself is a little more technical. It's a phrase that's been used to describe what happens when two or more unrelated technologies or unrelated technological paths converge unexpectedly to create an entirely new field. And I'll speak a little more about what that means. So, convergence in the context of digital technology, or what I'm going to call cyber technology today, is not a new or even a recent phenomenon. Arguably, convergence has been going on since the inception of computers and computing technologies. If you go back to the late 50s, early 60s, for example, computer networking technology itself resulted from the convergence of then standalone mainframe computer machines and communications technologies in the late 1960s and early 70s. Howard Rheingold, I mentioned in the previous slide, notes that virtual reality technology resulted from the convergence of video technology and computer hardware back in the 1980s. So it's kind of been an ongoing, emerging, converging technological strain. In some cases, convergent technologies have led to entirely new fields. I don't claim that all emerging technologies result from convergence, but I do claim that all emerging technologies, I do not claim that they're all the direct result of convergence, but many, if not most, have resulted from some kind of convergence. So cyber technology has also converged with some non-cyber technologies to create brand new fields. It now seems to be doing that at an unprecedented pace. So for example, I'll just pick one right here. Cyber-related technologies and biotechnologies had previously converged in ways that created, at the time, relatively new fields such as bioinformatics, computational biology, and computational genomics, among many other ones. And if you just look, for example, at the field of computational genomics, that was made possible by the integration of computational techniques from AI, including data mining algorithms, and genomics research. And that was used very successfully to model the human genome during that project. So rather than having to do a hand sequencing in the wet lab, biologists were able to use computational techniques. There's an irony, though. The same technology that was used to accelerate the sequencing of the human genome in the early 2000s has also threatened the privacy of research subjects who are needed to participate in population genomic studies. So other kinds of ethical issues that arose in this field were informed consent versus presumed consent for research subjects, because data mining techniques were used in ways that you couldn't necessarily agree to consent to things down the road that could pop up later on. Another problem that resulted was the ownership of personal genetic data that was stored in digital databases. And there was a famous case in Iceland called the Decode Genetics controversy, where it was a question of who owned one's personal DNA. So these are some of the ethical challenges that arise from converging technologies. Another field of convergence, nanocomputing, also resulted from technological convergence. It resulted from the convergence of cyber technology and nanotechnology. And this even gave rise to a new field of applied ethics called nanoethics, which is developed in response to issues at the intersection of nanotechnology and applied ethics. John Weckert and Jim Moore have done some work in this area, nanoethics, and among the many issues, they mentioned three: privacy concerns affecting nano-level devices, which are almost impossible to see; nano-level scale weapons that could either be developed or acquired by terrorists and rogue nations; or runaway nanobots, leading to the gray goose scenario, where nanobots could perhaps unintentionally disassemble matter, which would lead to a kind of a disaster. So there are a number of new and emerging technologies. We seem to hear about new technologies almost on a daily basis. And a recent report by the Bank of America identified 14 emerging technologies from a financial point of view of investment, but they didn't mention any of their ethical implications. So among those were some interesting emerging technologies: brain-computer interfaces, emotional artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, electrical vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, next-gen batteries, ocean tech, green mining, carbon capture and storage, and something called the metaverse, which is gaining attention in the US. For example, Facebook now calls its parent company Meta. They seem to be moving in a direction where they want to exploit this. I will not examine any of these technologies or their ethical aspects today. I simply point them out. They're interesting and deserve their own presentations. Another emerging technology I will not examine today, but one that's gained considerable attention in the media, is autonomous vehicles or smart cars, which is the converging of AI and automotive technology. So today I'm going to focus briefly on some ethical applications involving two relatively new emerging technologies: ambient intelligence and the Internet of Things. So ambient intelligence, or AMI, has been defined as a technology that enables people to live and work in environments that respond to them in intelligent ways. And here you can see, for example, definitions by Arts and Bray and Weber and others. So AMI was made possible by developments in the field of artificial intelligence, among other technologies, thus also illustrating one more example of how technologies can converge unexpectedly to yield a new technology or new field. So specifically, AMI, or ambient intelligence, emerged from the convergence of or interplay between three relatively recent technologies, which are its key components: pervasive computing, ubiquitous communication, and intelligent user interfaces. And I'll say just a few words about each of those. So pervasive computing, as its name implies, can be defined as computing environment where information and communication technology are everywhere for everyone at all times. They're constantly there. They're surrounding us, they're pervading us. This is from the Center for Pervasive Computing. Ubiquitous communication is a technology which ensures that communications between interlinked smart computing devices is continuous, flexible, and always present, or omnipresent. And the third, intelligent user interfaces, or IUIs, go beyond what we think of as traditional interfaces like a keyboard, a mouse, a monitor, etc. And they improve human interaction with technology, also making it more intuitive and efficient. So some IUIs can actually know or sense far more about a person, including information about that person's situation, its context, environment, much more than was possible with traditional interfaces. And people are often unaware of the existence of IUIs in their environments because they're miniature, they're embedded in walls or objects. And we're surrounded with these intelligent network computers that are always aware of us. Okay, so there's a little bit of an imbalance there. Another emerging technology that I'll just speak briefly about is the Internet of Things. And this was sort of made possible by developments in AMI technology, okay, which have helped to bring about what I'm calling Internet of Things, or IoT. So the Internet of Things enables humans to interact with objects or things. That is, in addition to the typical kinds of websites and standard digital devices that are connected to the Internet. So on the one hand, humans have been interacting with intelligent agents and with smart devices for several years now. But on the other hand, the idea of smart devices and smart objects or things communicating with one another, that is independent of human interaction or human oversight, as in the case of IoT, a recent phenomenon. So both ambient intelligence, Internet of Things have helped to make possible things like smart homes, smart buildings, etc. But Internet of Things also enables users to search for things or objects via search engines like Shodan, which indexes things such as webcams, smart TVs, smart refrigerators, etc., that are plugged in or connected to the Internet. So the kinds of Internet searches now possible because of IoT can go well beyond the typical kinds of searches that users have conducted in the past when looking for information on conventional search engines such as Google, which index only the web via standard URLs or Universal Resource Locator's various links, HTTP, www. So what about these technologies? One of my concerns is some of the ethical issues that they bring about, that they generate. So among the many kinds of ethical controversies affecting AMI and IoT, I'll briefly describe this afternoon 3 kinds of ethics-related concepts or concerns. One is freedom and autonomy. A second is technological dependency. And a third, I'm going to call privacy, surveillance, and the panopticon. Okay, so I'll begin a bit with autonomy and freedom. The question is, will human autonomy and freedom be enhanced, increased, or will it be diminished as a result of AMI and IoT technologies? There are 2 schools of thought. Proponents of these technologies suggest that humans will gain more control over their environments because AMI and IoT technologies will be more responsive to their needs. So we'll get more freedom, we'll get more control. But there's an irony here. Philip Ray pointed this out, a certain kind of paradox here. We're getting greater control, presumably, but only by delegating control to machines. So what is going on here? Are we gaining control or are we losing control by delegating more and more control to machines? So it turns out that AMI and IoT could instead diminish the amount of freedom, the amount of control that humans have over their environments. A second concern is with technological dependency. Consider how much we have already come to depend on cyber technology in conducting so many activities in our day-to-day lives. We depend on Google today, or we depend on Zoom to meet during a pandemic, for example. We are very much dependent on these technologies. In the future, will humans come to depend on AMI, IoT, and other smart technologies, including smart objects and smart environments, in ways that exceed our current dependency on technology? What would happen to us if we were to lose some of our cognitive capacities because of an increased dependency on smart technologies? On the one hand, smart technologies could relieve us of having to worry about performing many of our routine, mundane, day-to-day tasks, which could be considered tedious and boring. Very good thing. On the other hand, however, smart technologies could also eliminate much of the cognitive effort that has in our past enabled us to be fulfilled and to flourish as humans. In fact, I often mention to my students that when it comes to doing preparations involving arithmetic or mathematics, I often do things longhand, like filling out tax preparations, so I don't lose my basic arithmetic skills from the 8th grade or something like that. It's so easy now to just use calculators to do all the kind of cognitive work. E.M. Forster, a British novelist, literary person, had this kind of concern many years ago in a classic work called The Machine Stops in 1909. And he was a bit of a visionary because Forster imagined a world far into the future where we have this amazing global machine that makes life so incredibly comfortable and pleasing for us. But over time, we lose touch with that machine. No one really knows anymore how to repair it or to operate it or to do what they need to keep it maintained. And one day, the machine breaks down. To fix it, what would that be like? And you can imagine today, if we were to lose electricity, what would that be like? What would happen? And that's a worry some people have for the technologies we depend on so much. We have so much information stored in our smartphones. We depend on our smartphones so much that if we were to lose them, or if the internet were to go down, what would that be like in terms of our dependency? A third concern we're going to call privacy, surveillance, and something called the panopticon. So, in one sense, privacy concerns have been around for a while. We're all aware of the various kinds of privacy invasions that can happen with digital technology that have been happening since day one. But regarding AMI and IoT, Longenrich has identified 4 key features that differentiate these emerging technologies from earlier kinds of cyber-specific privacy issues. For one thing, there is the ubiquity, the omnipresence. The technology is all around us. It's embedded in objects. It could be in walls, in rooms, in ceilings, and floors. So the privacy threats are more pervasive in scope because the technology itself, the devices are ubiquitous and omnipresent, always there. The invisibility factors. Computers now are virtually invisible in some AMI and IoT environments. They're getting closer and closer to the nano level. We have microprocessors embedded in so many objects. So users may not realize that computing devices are present where they are in a room or an environment, and they're being used to collect and disseminate their personal data. A third is the sensing factor. I mentioned that the IUIs now can know things about us, sense possibly our fear in the future. They're becoming so sophisticated they'll be able to sense our private emotions like fear, stress, excitement, etc. And a fourth concern is something called memory application, like a memory log. So technologies have the potential to create a memory log for a complete record of someone's past. So if you live in a smart home or a smart apartment, the technology can be recording your conversations. At some point, you'll be able to play back a kind of, this is your life. All your conversations of November 17th, 2022, for example. In the future, you may be able to have that an indefinite. So there's kind of no escaping, no going back from the past. This was always, everything was going to be recorded going forward in this memory application. In these kinds of environments, no one can be sure that he or she is not being observed, since the technology is ubiquitous, omnipresent, etc. So it would seem to be very prudent or very wise for people interacting in these environments to assume that information about their presence at any location, at any time, is being observed and recorded. In this sense, people in AMI and IoT environments are subject to a virtual panopticon. It's a term coined by philosopher and social scientist Jeremy Bentham back in the 18th century in 1787. And the question now is, will Bentham's 18th century model of the inspection house or panopticon likely be extended to contemporary public spaces such as the workplace and public buildings, and will also be extended to private, intimate environments as well, such as our homes, apartments, and so forth. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with Bentham's inspection house or the prison of the panopticon, imagine a prison in which there is only one prison guard sitting at a desk. And imagine that around him in a circle is a series of prison cells that are all lined up in a circle. And the prison cells all have glass doors in front of them. The prison guard can see in, but the inmates inside the cells cannot see out. The prison guard's desk rotates, so he's constantly going around in a very slow motion, observing what's going on inside each cell. So the prisoner inside has no idea at what moment, at what point in time, the prison guard is actually observing or not observing him in the cell. So it would be prudent for him to act as if he's being observed at every moment. So the question then becomes for us, what effects could the possibility of being permanently observed have on our individual behavior, especially if it's used by governments as a form of social control? So it's a question that may be an unintended consequence of some of these emerging technologies. In Bentham's classic panopticon back in the 18th century, A prisoner could not be certain whether he or she was actually being monitored at any given point in time. But critics note that people living in AMI or IoT environments can, with almost 100% certainty, know that they are being observed by the technology. Classical forms of surveillance from Bentham's time to the period preceding AMI and IoT technologies were limited to factors involving both time and place. There were limitations on what could be gathered and recorded and stored. In AMI and IoT environments will, as critics point out, persist across space and across time. There are no limits or barriers here. We might assume this kind of captured data is completely innocuous or harmless, not realizing it could also be used to create personal profiles and then used by third parties to make important decisions about us. So observations in our demeanor, our gait, our style could be linked to other kinds of data and data mining techniques to create a portfolio in which suggests that we are determined or we're prone to do this kind of activity versus that kind of activity. Maybe if you walk a certain way or do a certain thing, you're more prone to international travel than if you did it the other way. And you can be targeted and a profile about you created based on that information, which may or may not be accurate. So the question I want to raise today is, do we have an adequate ethical framework to handle the kinds of challenges arising from AMI, IoT, and other emerging technologies? So I'm going to shift now to the question of whether our standard applied ethics framework is sufficiently robust. Okay, so what is the standard applied ethics framework? Typically, when analyzing controversial ethical issues, philosophers use a strategy or methodology I'm going to call the standard applied ethics framework, which has three components. And you can see people like Philip Bray and others who discuss this in their work as well. So the first step is to identify a particular controversial technology or controversial practice as a moral problem. Secondly, describe and analyze the clarifying concepts associated with that problem. And third, apply certain moral theories and principles, for example, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, these are all ethical theories, in the deliberative process to reach a position about that moral issue. So, for example, if I were to use a non-technology moral issue like euthanasia, okay, so at the first stage, I'm going to identify that as a problem. Well, why? It's a life and death issue. Some believe it may be murder. So at the second stage, I want to describe and analyze and clarify some concepts. Well, what do you mean? Do you mean active euthanasia, passive euthanasia? Do you mean voluntary euthanasia, involuntary euthanasia? So we need to clarify which of these categories that we're going to look at. And then finally, once we look at that, so suppose, for example, someone looks at active euthanasia, active involuntary euthanasia. Well, they might say from a utilitarian point of view, maybe you could justify that. But from a deontological point of view, no, because it would be treating people as a means to an end and so on and so forth. So that would just be one way in which the standard ethics model has been used to date. The question I'm raising, is that framework still adequate today in an era of emerging technologies, including AMI and IoT and other relevant technologies? So I'm going to argue for the need for an adequate ethical framework which goes a little bit beyond that. We can begin by asking who exactly is impacted by new and emerging technologies. Is it a subgroup? Is it everyone? Well, the ethical concerns surrounding ambient intelligence and things, as well as many other recent new emerging smart technologies, affect many parties or stakeholders, including the software engineers and programmers who design and implement these technologies, but also ordinary people like us, virtually everyone who will be affected by these technologies in the near future. So we would all benefit from clear ethical policies and guidelines that address the research and development of these and other new emerging technologies. In the past, ethical analysis was typically done after the fact. That is, after new technology was already available and in place. Some refer to this strategy as an ethics last approach. Okay, we have this technology, now what do we do with it? What about the ethical aspects of it? What do we do? Well, that usually comes at the end. The technology is out, and then we have an ethics last approach to this. So ethics was typically reactive in the sense that it had followed scientific developments rather than informing scientific research. Moore and Weckert note that in many scientific research areas, ethics has had to play catch up because guidelines were developed in response to cases where serious harm had already resulted. We have this technology, it results in deaths, what do we do about it? Because of the many difficulties with an ethics last approach, some have argued more recently for an ethics first type of strategy. So, for example, when research began on the Human Genome Project in the 1980s, researchers developed an ethical framework that came to be known as the ELSI model, the ethical, legal, and social issues, to anticipate proactively some ethical issues that would likely arise. So we had a shift here. Instead of doing ethics at the end, we're saying, wait a minute, let's look at the potential harm that could result from this before we go forward. It's a very, very different approach to ethical analysis. In fact, work on that project was halted, held in place until the guidelines were in place. Until they could work out the LC guidelines, they put a halt on the research. But one question we can ask, is an ethics first approach similar to the ELSI model an improvement over the traditional approaches to moral problems? Will that strategy help us to better understand and resolve ethical issues arising in the context of emerging technologies? Many think it's a very promising approach. Specifically, would an ethics first model like ELSI have worked best in addressing the kinds of controversial issues that arose and continue to arise now in new and emerging technologies like ambient intelligence and Internet of Things? As already suggested or implied, many consider the ELSI framework to be an ideal model because it is a proactive rather than the traditional kind of reactive ethics framework. But some philosophers, including Moore and Weckert, are critical of the ELSI model and of an ethics-first approach in general. That might not be the best way to go. So, Moore and Weckert believe that ethics-first kinds of frameworks have at least two problems with them. The first is that the model depends on what they call factual determination of the specific harms and benefits of a technology before any realistic or adequate ethical assessment can be done. The second problem is, in the case of many, if not most, emerging technologies, it's difficult to know what the future will be. Those kinds of concerns. So we can ask whether an ELSI-like or an ethics-first model would work best in cases of emerging technologies like AMI and IoT. Critics such as Moore and Weckert believe that if we use an ELSI-like ethics model, it might seem appropriate to put a moratorium on research, to halt the research in a specific emerging technology until we get all the facts, until they're all done. Also put out that while a moratorium would halt technology developments in some particular area, like in the genome case, it won't necessarily advance our understanding of the ethical issues around that emerging technology. So maybe it is not as promising a model as some people had thought. So, should we instead then turn back to an ethics last kind of model? Is that a good thing? Some critics, again including Moore and Weckert, argued that turning back to a more traditional ethics last model is not desirable either. Once the new technology is in place, much unnecessary harm may already have occurred. So neither an ethics first, like the ELSI model, nor a more traditional ethics last model would seem adequate in handling ethical issues arising in the context of many emerging technologies. So ethics is not a static, but a dynamic kind of enterprise. And I agree with Moore and Weckert that it's something that needs to be done continually. That is, as a specific new technology develops, and as the technology's potential consequences become better understood. So it's not something to be done before or after, but during the entire process. So an adequate ethical model needs to be dynamic because the factual component on which it relies has to be continually updated as the technology changes, as we learn more and more facts about that technology. We noted that when analyzing controversial ethical issues, many philosophers and ethicists have used a strategy we described as the standard applied ethics framework. Recall that framework has three components or steps, right? We identify the controversial issue as a moral problem. We describe, analyze the clarifying concepts associated with the problem. And then we apply moral theories and principles in the deliberative process to reach a position about that moral issue. But I'm proposing we can add a fourth step to that classic model, building on the insights of Moore and Weckert. We could add a new step, step 4, which says update the ethical analysis by continuing to differentiate between the factual, descriptive, and normative components of the new or emerging technology under consideration. Revise our policies affecting that technology as necessary, especially as the factual data changes or as more information about the potential social impacts become clearer. So we have a dynamic process here, a kind of a feedback loop where we constantly revisit that and then go through the process again of applying ethical theories. So applying this dynamic ethics model is, I think, the way to go. And I've argued that we benefit by expanding on the standard ethics model in response to these new emerging technologies. But I have not argued for a brand new ethical framework. Some people believe that we need a whole new framework. We should instead expand upon the existing model. I also believe that there are other ways that the standard model can be expanded and improved upon without needing a brand new model. I'm next going to briefly comment on two of them. That is, expanding the model to include a sub-step in step 1 to identify any hidden or embedded values that may be latent in a particular technology as it's being designed at the research and development phase. And secondly, an additional step I'm going to call step 5 that will respond to questions about moral consideration for AI entities, such as sophisticated social robots, who reach a certain rational or sentient threshold of development. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now, and I'm going to move from the emerging technologies of IoT and AMI and talk a little bit about the first step of identifying moral problems. So the first challenge is at the design stage for new and emerging technologies. First of all, challenges of this kind have been addressed in the literature by a number of authors. I mentioned Philip Ray, Bhatia Friedman, and others have been aware of this kind of problem. Friedman and all have argued for a scheme they call value-sensitive design, or VSD, which would identify and expose human values that need to be considered at the design stage of technological development. So they envision social scientists working with computer scientists sitting down looking at what kinds of human values are at risk here. In a similar way, although a different model, Philip Ray has argued for something called a disclosive model, where hidden normative values, both moral and non-moral, in software development need to be identified and disclosed at the design stage. And I'll speak more about this in just a few seconds. Bray also has argued for an anticipatory technology ethics model for emerging technologies, which aims at anticipating moral problems at the design stage in research and development for new and emerging technologies. That's an interesting model, but I've already pointed out some problems with trying to anticipate and forecast ethical problems in the case of emerging technologies. More attention to what he had to say, what Bray has to say about the disclosive model, which I think can help us expand the existing standard framework. So I guess I'll just briefly comment on some points raised in Bray 2004, excuse me. So the disclosive model of computer ethics. So Bray argues that because of embedded built-in biases in cyber technology, the standard applied ethics methodology is not adequate for identifying cyber ethics issues. For example, he notes that using a standard model, we might fail to notice certain features embedded in the design of a technology. We might fail to recognize that certain practices involving that technology can have moral implications. It's not that people are doing intentionally bad things, they may just fail to notice some of these embedded features in the technology. Bray also points out that one weakness of the standard model of applied ethics is that it tends to focus on known moral controversies as opposed to ones that are new. He refers to practices that have moral implications but are not yet known as having morally opaque or morally non-transparent features, which he contrasts with what we typically think of as morally transparent features. And these, I'll just say something about that. So for example, when people were designing cookies technology, this may be for offering web owners a way to track the incoming traffic on their website, how many visitors, how long were they staying, etc. But some have argued that, wait a minute though, that has privacy implications for users because users now are being tracked and they may have no idea. So there wasn't as if there was something intentionally wrong being built in, but people may not have known about this because it seemed morally opaque. Or they may be concerned about, they may be aware of privacy concerns, but they may not understand what data mining technology is. So his point, Bray's point was we need to make this more transparent. So following Bray's insight, we can add a sub-step to our first step in the expanded model. Step 1A, and that would be disclose at the development stage of technology any hidden or opaque features or issues that have moral implications. And I'll return to that again at the very end. So I want to now move to the second and final part of the challenge for the standard applied ethics model. And I mentioned the challenge from AI ethics. And of course, there are many issues that could potentially arise here. I'm going to look at one of them, but one could argue that AI potentially raises several challenges for the standard applied ethics framework. I mean, I just mentioned briefly autonomous vehicles, which has AI technology built into it. In fact, AI is embedded in the fabric of so many technologies that we could also raise that. But I'm going to focus my attention on just one of these. I'm not going to address those many AI-related concerns. I can't today. Instead, I want to focus on one specific question. It's an important one, I think. Do at least some AI entities, very sophisticated, deserve, or will they eventually qualify for some kind of moral consideration? This question was initially raised by Luciano Floridi in 1999 when he argued that what he called information objects could have intrinsic worth and thus should have at least some moral standing, perhaps as what he calls moral patience. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So he's already beginning to think about giving them some kind of moral consideration. Floridi at the time also pointed out that just as we now grant moral consideration to biological and ecological entities in what he calls the biosphere or ecosphere, for example, to animals and plants, we again need to extend the domain of moral consideration to include non-biological entities or information objects that comprise what he calls the infosphere. So what about this question of moral status, moral consideration for AI entities? A related and perhaps much more controversial question that has recently been debated has to do with whether some AI entities deserve full-fledged rights. Well, in October 2017, a very sophisticated robot named Sophia was officially granted full civil rights by the government of Saudi Arabia. And this made headlines around the world. It's kind of bizarre because you're granting civil rights to a robot where people themselves don't enjoy full civil rights. The European Union is currently considering the question of whether and how to grant legal status, rights, protections to certain kinds of robots. So questions about robot rights have gained the attention of law and policymakers in many countries, as well as the interests of academics like ourselves. But I will not address that issue head on today, since I believe that the key question now has to do with whether to grant some form of moral consideration to some AI entities, without necessarily having to give those entities full-fledged rights, legal, civil, or otherwise. So I'm putting the question of rights totally aside and just want to focus instead on this question of moral consideration of some sort. What would be the rationale, the justification for granting moral consideration to some AI entities? Prior to the 20th century, many ethicists, and most laypersons in the Western world at least, generally assumed that only human beings deserved moral consideration. All other entities, animals, trees, natural objects, etc., were viewed merely as resources for humans to use and misuse. For example, animals were typically viewed as mere resources, and it was assumed that humans had no moral obligations at all toward animals. By the mid-20th century, the assumption that moral consideration should be granted only to humans had been challenged on two fronts. One came from animal rights organizations and groups who argued that because animals, like humans, are sentient creatures who are capable of feeling pleasure and pain, they should be granted ethical consideration. So in this view, it would be morally wrong for humans to abuse animals or to treat them simply as resources for human use. One area comes from the notion of animal rights. A second challenge to the view that only humans deserve moral consideration came from some environmentalists who made an even bolder claim, arguing that we should extend ethical consideration to include new kinds of objects or entities. Many of these environmentalists were influenced by a novel moral system introduced by Hans Jonas. I'll talk about him a little bit at the end. And Jonas argued that because modern technologies involving atomic and nuclear power, have presented us with tools of mass destruction that could devastate our planet on a scale never before imaginable, we need to expand our sphere of moral consideration to include new objects of moral consideration. New objects of moral consideration. And these objects included natural objects such as trees, land, the environment itself, as well as abstract objects such as future generations of humans that will inherit the planet, if there is one to inherit. And that's why he believes that these objects, these natural objects, trees, land, the environment, deserve moral consideration. We have to pay attention to them and grant them some kind of moral status. The past 50 years or so, our thinking about both who and what should be included in the sphere of moral consideration has evolved significantly. We have moved from a traditional moral system that granted consideration only to human beings to one that at least debates whether animals, land, and the entire biosphere also deserve at least some degree of moral consideration. So we've come quite a distance in the past half century. Do we once again need to expand our sphere of moral consideration to include some new objects? That is, non-natural or artificial objects such as sophisticated AI entities. I believe that the answer to this question is likely going to be yes. So the rationale continued moral patience, I mentioned before, versus moral agents. One question we can now ask is whether some very sophisticated artificial entities, such as advanced social robots, merit moral consideration because they, like humans, have rational abilities. It could also have sentient capacities, but rational ability I'll look at first. If a key justification for granting moral consideration to humans is based on the premise that humans are rational entities, rational entities also qualify as rational entities, then we can make a compelling case for granting them at least some moral consideration. For example, even if these rational and highly sophisticated AI entities do not qualify as full-blown moral agents, that is, as typical adult humans do, like us, they may nevertheless meet the threshold of what Floridi calls moral patience, which he contrasts with moral agents. In Floridi's scheme, a moral patient is a receiver of moral action, while moral agents, on the other hand, are sources of moral action because they are capable of causing moral harm or moral good. The others are mere receivers because they're not capable of intentionally causing moral harm or moral good. So, like moral agents, moral patients enjoy moral consideration and thus have at least some moral standing. Unlike moral agents, however, moral patients cannot be held morally responsible for their actions. And for example, we don't hold children under a certain age morally responsible for their actions. So they're not fully moral agents, but they are moral patients. They have moral standing. A more interesting question, which I will not try to answer today, is whether AI entities that at least appear to exhibit consciousness could also eventually qualify as moral agents. I leave that question open. I just simply throw it out there as something to consider for philosophers in the future. But we do not need to answer that question to defend the view that some advanced AI entities might already qualify for at least some degree of moral consideration as moral patients. I believe we should expand the applied ethics model once again to address this point. In doing so, we can employ some key insights from Hans Jonas's work with his novel moral system. So I'm going to try and give a sketch of Hans Jonas's argument, which is a bit technical. I'll try to go through it a bit slowly. It's a little precise and tedious, but following lines. I'm going to use a series of premises, 4 premises followed by a conclusion, quoting his work. So in his 1984 work, Jonas argues that traditional ethical systems have tended to view moral responsibility as something that was restricted to human action in interhuman relationships, a kind of what he calls neighbor ethics, limited to the direct dealing of man with man in the here and now, not looking at man and other kinds of organisms, creatures, objects, nature. Secondly, he argues that our traditional conception of ethics is no longer adequate in an era of modern technology because the nature of human action itself has changed in fundamental ways because of the power of, for example, nuclear energy and nuclear warfare. So new objects of action have been added, which in turn have opened up for us a whole new dimension of ethical relevance. Premise 3. Because ethics is concerned with human action, a change in ethics is now required. That is what Jonas calls novel powers to act, made possible by modern technology, require novel ethical rules and have created for us a new moral condition. Premise 4. Our moral condition has been altered by the need to extend what he calls the sphere of moral consideration to provide these additional ethical objects, which also include some abstract objects, as I mentioned before, such as the future generations of human beings who will inherit the earth, as well as the whole of nature itself. From that, we can conclude that the new moral condition ushered in by the altered nature of human action and the introduction of these new ethical objects provides us some new important issues of moral responsibility, and we now have a new dimension of moral responsibility. So I'm going to use his conclusion here, the first what I call C1, as a premise for two more steps to get to the conclusion about AI entities. So continuing on with his argument, I'm going to take the conclusion from the previous one, we'll call that premise 5 now. The new moral condition ushered in by the altered nature of human action and the introduction of new ethical objects has raised some important issues, and we now have a new dimension of moral responsibility from before. Premise 6, once again, some new objects, namely some very sophisticated AI entities such as social robots, have been added, which increase our powers to act in significant ways, and thus, once again, Jonas refers to as a new dimension of ethical relevance. And from that, I want to conclude that these new objects or entities, that is, these very sophisticated social robots, can also qualify as ethical robots. Since they can do this, our moral condition is once again altered, and we need to expand further our dimension of responsibility to include these objects. So, employing some of Jonas's insights and expanding the framework, I'd like to add a new step. So based on Jonas's insights, I propose to expanding the standard applied ethics model to include a new step. Step 5, determine whether any emerging or new AI entity qualifies as an ethical object by considering 3 key questions. A, has the introduction of this object entity significantly changed the nature of human action? That is, by providing us with novel powers to act in a way or ways that opens up a new dimension of ethical relevance. B, can this new object, AI entity, significantly affect future generations of humans as well as the sustainability of our planet in ways that cause serious harm? And C, will this new object, AI entity, even though it's a non-biological entity or non-biological life form, significantly modify our moral condition and enhance our dimension of responsibility? Okay, and these are the 3 questions I think you would need to consider at this point. So, in my closing remarks then, I'm going to just flesh out the full outline for a broadly expanded model of applied ethics. I propose the following expanded version of the applied ethics framework, going back to the first 3 steps, identify the particular controversial technology or practice, and also add step 1A to disclose the hidden and opaque features in the new technology that have moral implications. Continue to describe, analyze, and clarify the ethical concepts associated with that problem. 3, apply the moral theories in the deliberative process. 4, update the analysis by continuing to differentiate between factual, descriptive, and normative components of new and emerging technologies under consideration. Revise those policies affecting the technology as necessary, especially as the factual data and changes or information about the potential social impacts becomes clearer. And then 5, finally, determine whether a new or emerging AI entity qualifies as an ethical object based on the 3 questions again. Has this object, as it's changed the nature of human action? Does it provide us with novel powers to act, give us a new dimension of ethical relevance? Can it significantly affect future generations of humans, as well as the sustainability of our planet? And will this new object, entity, even though it's a non-biological entity, life form, significantly modify our moral condition, dimension of responsibility? So this is just a list of sources I referenced, and I'll just say a few more things about my own references in the next slide. And finally, some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank again Professor Quien for inviting me to present today's doctoral symposium. I'd like to thank my colleague Lloyd Carr at Rivier University for his comments on an earlier draft of my presentation, also for pointing out to me the list of the 14 new emerging technologies that I mentioned earlier from the Bank of America report. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your kind attention. I look forward to your questions. And I'll just also say that in composing this talk, I've drawn from some concepts, examples, and arguments in chapters 1, 11, and 12 of my Wiley textbook, Ethics and Technology, as well as some other previously published works, and I list those here. And I guess that will do it. So I'm going to, I guess, stop sharing.
Yes, it stops.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Tavani, for your presentation. I think we can make questions in this moment. If you want to make some questions, just raise hands, and I will give you the microphone system open. So if anyone wants to ask something, please begin right now. I am if anybody is at the YouTube channel and wants to make some questions, I can translate to this Meet system. So let's start. If you agree, Doctor. Okay. Professor Marta Patiño first.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Professor Herman Tavani, good afternoon. Very interesting, the presentation about the moral topics underlying the technological problems raised by new technologies. I just have a consideration, and I would like to ask you, what do you think about this? Following Norbert Wiener, technologies are ways of ordering our world. Many inventions or technological systems used today in our everyday lives are the result of some way of thinking. Societies choose structures, consciously or not, that have influence over the ways people understand themselves or relate to each other or to consume. There has to be a new interpretation of the world we live in, which includes design artifacts and the consequences of these designs in society, identifying realms of power, following Michel Foucault. Because there are realms of power that decide what artifacts or systems are introduced in our societies. So, the political aspects should be addressed in order to analyze how technological innovations are rooted in economic systems and ideological orientations, which are structures that pervade our beliefs and activities.
Thank you. It's an excellent question, or a series of questions. I'll try to respond to them. You mentioned Norbert Wiener, I think Foucault, and a couple of things. Let me just say that thank you for bringing up Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener, as you undoubtedly know, was a visionary and coined the term cybernetics. And he was an interdisciplinary scholar at MIT back in the 40s. And he was one of these people who's hard to pin down in terms of boundaries. I mean, he had done work in a very technical field. I think it was in radar research that sort of brought him onto this. And by the way, just as an aside, if you're interested in reading more about Norbert Wiener's influence in cyber ethics, there's some wonderful papers by a professor at Southern Connecticut State University named Terrell Bynum, who has done amazing work with him. Wiener, yes, he saw this need to reorganize, to understand technology, to look at the power differential, and you mentioned Foucault, and also it's interesting too because Foucault ties in with the panopticon. He was the one who I think was helpful in revising that notion, originally introduced by Bentham House, and so I'm trying to remember the last part of your question or your comment on the political structures of that. I just wish there were more people like for example, Norbert Wiener, and another visionary also you may be aware of is Joseph Weizenbaum, a computer scientist at MIT. And if I could just name three people who I thought were definitely visionary with regard to the moral problems with technology, how it could endanger us, it would be Wiener, Weizenbaum, and Hans Jonas. Those three. And as far as I think your other question may have had to do with policy implications. And how that gets converted, I'm not sure. I know in that fourth step I'm advocating in that applied ethics model is to bring in policymakers into the field with the technologists, because they're the people who are going to be deciding how that technology is going to be used in terms of social structure, and whether it's going to be used in negative ways to have a power imbalance, a power asymmetry, where governments, for example, have the upper hand in terms of surveillance and control. And I hope that answer wasn't too rambling. It was a very rich question, and I apologize.
Martha, do you want to continue?
Please. Yeah, the thing I want to come about is that before we think about ethical problems and how to solve them related to technology, mm-hmm. There will be necessary that we address the ideology that is pervading the decisions about what artifact or what technology becomes an innovation, and how this goes to society. Mm-hmm. Okay, that is the bottom line of my question.
Right. So you're looking at the pre-ethical kind of considerations, and looking at the reigning ideology of it. So it sort of mixes the politics and the technology. And to be honest, it's beyond my field, beyond my purview, my expectations. I mean, I think it's a very, very important question. I think it has sociological implications for, I think, political scientists, sociologists could engage that more articulately or competently or eloquently than I can. I think it's an excellent question, by the way. I don't think I have the answer. I mean, I agree that there should be some pre-ethical analysis done. I've tried to mention that, I think, in the case of Philip Bray, and looking for those kinds of hidden, embedded values. But the question of the prevailing ideology is one that I mean, I agree with you, and yet I'm unable, with my limited expertise, to comment intelligently on that question. So I think I'm just going to just acknowledge it as a very important, and thank you for raising it.
Thank you.
Okay, Orlando, can you read your question or ask your question to Dr. Tavani, please?
But of course, thank you. First of all, thanks to Dr. Tavani for your presentation. I just want to ask a single question. I read it to anticipate some ethical issues, which, as long as I understand, acts on ready-to-use technological artifacts. What do you think on the possibility to let me read. What do you think on the possibility to get into another expanded ethics framework supported on specific new informatics, epistemological or cyber technology epistemological issues, preventing or controlling research objects in engineering research? In this way, let me tell you, I believe we will not have to discuss on artifacts, but on humankind actions.
Okay, so I think I missed something at the very beginning of your question. I apologize too. So you at the very end, you said something about moving away from artifacts to human actions. That was the focus of where you wanted to go with that?
Well, my focus is on the oriented our thinking before the artifacts.
Yeah.
Just focusing on all the issues, methodological issues, or methodological engineering issues, before thinking in artifacts, before their existence.
Yeah.
So we can concentrate on human actions, not in artifacts and their effects on human beings.
Yeah. So, that's interesting. So then, so it's more at the conceptual stage then. It's not the artifact you want to focus on, but rather the action. You're anticipating the action, any existent or even before the research and design stage. You're thinking, was that what I'm?
You're right.
Correct. That's also interesting too, and it's sort of just trying to think who are the kind of people that would anticipate what body of academic group would be best to look at that concern, because quite frankly, as in the previous case, I'm looking at it from this very narrow scope or lens through the ethical analysis, and I'm not thinking in terms of the broader ideological or conceptual stage. And I agree with you, by the way, about the emphasis on action. And I think that was Jonas's point. I think we often overlook that's a very, very important part of this whole thing. Ethics is about human action. So it's something I don't think I could put into the framework because it wouldn't fit in there. It's something pre-framework. It's something that needs to be thought about independent of the artifact, you're right, of the object of the artifact. And I think, again, I'm just trying to think who would be the best academic, what would be the best academic field to do that? Maybe some brands, some European continental philosophers would be looking at that kind of thing. But I wish I had a clearer answer or a more specific answer or a better way to guide you. I agree with the importance of your question. I'm just not sure, as an applied ethics person, how to answer that in a way that fits in with the scheme that I'm working at with this model. But thank you again for your excellent question.
Thank you, Dr. Tavani.
Next question, Liliana, please. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting.
I'm
We
sorry.
can hear you.
I can't, yeah.
We can hear you.
You can't, or you can.
It's, the volume is low.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. Well, I am a biologist. I am a molecular biologist. You address these very serious problems, if you can call them in a way, from the philosophical point of view. And of course, I mean, it is like a really big concern. For example, when I teach my students about all these new technologies and how they're going to really affect our life. Well, they do affect our life now, but how they will affect even more our descendants.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is basically, who is really in charge of taking decisions about these issues? Because technology is there and nobody is going to stop it. I was thinking, for example, when cell phones were invented a few years ago, nobody would have thought that it would be a really big problem for children and for teenagers, for example. So if people would have known that cell phones were going to affect the way that people interact with one another, anyway, that technology would still be produced, because that's the way the world works.
Yeah.
Who is really in charge of making the decisions on how to handle these equations?
Right. Good question. And I think it raises the international aspect of this as well, may I say, because I tend to be sort of locked in my own little world. I look at mostly things that affect the laws of my own country, and a little more so with the European Union. But it's not as if there's an international body, an international regulatory body out there, which, and I think there, I guess, of course, you're the biologist, you're the molecular biologist. So, I mean, there may be a international committee, for example, on cloning. I hope there is. I assume there might be. But on other things, I mean, it tends to be, so, I mean, just a case in point, if you look at the difference between what goes on in the European Union and, say, the United States in terms of privacy policy, worlds apart where that's going to be. So getting agreement, and I think there has to be understandings certainly between countries, communities, when you have employees. If I'm working, for example, in Colombia, or you're working in there's certain rules we have to sort of abide by, and I think that applies for the European Union as well. My fear is that there is no I'm thinking of nanotechnology in particular and nanoscale weapons and devices. I mean, there is no regulatory body. I mean, the best we're doing is within nations, trying to keep a lid on it. But then going to the international community, to the UN doesn't seem to have anything on this. So the only thing I can say to your question, I thought your example of cell phones is brilliant in a way, because I mean, who would have thought? I mean, again, a converging technology. I mean, what is this device, right? Is it a phone? Is it a camera? Is it whatever it happens to be? But if you think back to the model I was talking about, the dynamic model, at one time someone said, well, wait a minute, we can't produce cell phones until after we figure out all the ethical. Well, you would never figure those out, because they continue to change, and you continue. I mean, that was the issue with the Genome Project. You had to put it on hold. On the other hand, waiting until the end, it's too late to do the ethics last on those. But the ones you raised, the ones that are going to affect the future, and that was Hans Jonas's concern too, our moral obligation to future generations of human beings who are going to inhabit the planet. It behooves us to move more toward international regulatory bodies. I am not aware of any. I mean, I know, for instance, if I just look at the question of intellectual property, for example, the debate between many countries in the West and, say, the People's Republic of China, just very, very different about what getting agreement on whether or not it'd be permissible to make unauthorized copies of software. So the question of who, it goes beyond the ethical framework. I mean, the only place where I can really begin to address that, I think, is in that fourth stage, where we have to have this dynamic ethics system in place, because as I said, these technologies affect all of us, not just the developers, not just a certain segment. They affect everyone, and they're continuously evolving. Something like cell phones or Facebook or the metaverse, and there has to be a dynamic in play. That's part. I think I have that part in the model to build that in, but how that gets pushed up to the international levels, I don't know. I mean, the best model I think so far as multi countries goes, is the European Union, because they have a number of signature countries agreeing to a certain policy. But as far as international agreements, I mean, look at the issue on climate right now. Look what the challenges are, and I mean, that's a pressing, critical issue that affects our own children. I mean, but anyway, I guess I'm kind of rambling on. All I can say is I agree with you, and I wish that somehow countries could come together to agree on an international body to regulate it. And I'll go particularly with nanotechnology as one of the scariest, although there are many other ones as well that fit that.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We got a question from YouTube channel. Nicolas Torres is asking, Dr. Tavani, as you mentioned the metaverse, what is your position about it? How do you think this is going to impact on the society?
Yeah. Well, again, I'll probably have to plead layperson here again, because I don't dabble in the metaverse, and I'm really struggling to understand fully what it means. And I'm just trying to think now. The closest thing I can think is, I imagine people are familiar with something called Second Life. People have avatars acting for them in Second Life. And for some people, that may be more interesting than their real life. And in some ways, the problems with the metaverse, as I see it, have already been anticipated by people in these other kinds of forums, where they have where they can be multiple characters, where they can have avatars with their personas interacting for them, with them in these different spheres. Where it gets very tricky is when you go from that one forum, call it Second Life or World of Warcraft or whatever it is, you have your acting for you, and then going across that into these virtual worlds and having your work life here and then I guess the question is going to be more sociological too. Will there be a kind of divide? Will certain individuals, will maybe people, more educated people have more access to this, and will it cause a gulf, like a digital divide, because the people that operate in the metaverse and don't operate in the metaverse? I don't know the answer to that question. It's something that I was just discussing with a few days ago with a friend about what that could portend in there. But quite frankly, I am still struggling with some of the nuances of what that means. I'm not clear everyone's operating on the same page. I hear different interpretations of the metaverse, and it's a very trendy term. And for example, Facebook executive Mark Zuckerberg has renamed the parent company Meta, because apparently he wants to make the Facebook part of the metaverse, or the metaverse Facebook, or whatever. So it's going to be an interesting challenge. And I guess it was one of those 14 new emerging technologies I mentioned briefly in the slides among from the Bank of America report, and one that I said I wouldn't be addressing today because well, I still don't know. I know it's emerging. I'm still not sure what it means. But since you raised that, it does sort of fit in, I think, nicely with the fourth step in the applied ethics model, where we recognize that, and we don't need to necessarily halt the technology. It's going to go. But we could make those, and not do the ethics first or last, but do it continually. I mean, I think it's just going to have, it's going to present itself in ways I can't anticipate. I'm not sure some of the developers can anticipate. But it should raise a number of ethical concerns just about the nature between the comfort level of operating in real life. I mean, because there are some people who prefer Second Life to real life. That's a whole other story. And the idea of having our avatars, I mean, just interact for us. It's a kind of a bizarre situation in one sense. I mean, what kind of control do you want over your real life in real time? I mean, just despite the advantages it could give you by having your avatar going out and do other kinds of things for you. So I guess I'll just stop there just with my musings, but it's totally speculative at this point.
Dr. Tavani, you said before that maybe we need to understand ethical issues when we are developing software in the stage of the design. In this kind of thinking, it's possible to. It is difficult for me to understand how an engineer, software engineer, can introduce some kind of a stage with ethical issues. Maybe I don't understand. Maybe they need to talk to a philosopher or an ethical specialist before doing that. I mean, it is a little bit difficult for me to understand in what stage of real software developed the scenario we can introduce these kind of things. I don't know if you think that this is possible.
That's a very, very good question. And in fairness, I think you're absolutely right. So let me just expand on that a little bit. Let me go back to two people. I mentioned Philip Bray, and I mentioned Friedman and all. And they both have, I just sort of superficially went over their models in a way so it fit into my scheme. But they developed the very point that you mentioned. So it's not, engineers shouldn't be expected. How would they alone? No, they're designed to write code, to implement code, to make that system reliable. I mean, they have moral responsibilities at that level itself. So what those groups, and I'll talk about Philip Bray's, I'm a little more familiar with his than the other. He envisions at the design stage, they're not only being software engineers, but also social scientists. Social scientists are very good at the kind of at the human design interface, ergonomics. I mean, let me just think back. Oftentimes, there's an example used when automobiles were being designed. For example, the engineers who developed them designed them for people like themselves. So in the U.S., it would be typically, I don't know, a male, Caucasian male, 5'10" or something, like 5 feet 10 inches or something. Well, that's fine, except a lot of people that drove automobiles were shorter people, and many women may have been like 5'2" or something. So there's a whole they just didn't pay attention, and it wasn't malicious. It just was their job was to design the vehicle. Software, I think, has a similar kind of analogy. Your task is to design a certain product, a website, whatever it's going to be. So, or some kind of aircraft, whatever it is. So at the design stage, you need to at least address, clarify some potential ethical issues. An engineer is not trained to do that. I mean, I think that's unfair too. I mean, engineers are certainly trained. They're given professional codes of ethics and moral responsibility. The International Society for example, the IEEE Engineering Society, the ACM, they have codes of conduct. I think engineers are aware of those. They can follow those. But to do this robustly, to do this meaningfully, they're talking about teams of people that require not just engineers, not just philosophers, not just social scientists, but people sort of working together, and maybe even a representative from public policy. That's not mentioned in their models. But until you do that, I don't think it's possible to realize that. I know that some companies do have human interaction people. They do have people with behavioral science backgrounds already there to anticipate some of these things. I'm not sure how many philosophers are actually brought on board for that, but I couldn't agree more with your position that it would be unfair, unrealistic to expect a person who's trained to be a professional engineer to also be a professional ethicist. It makes no sense. So you would need to bring in a team of people in addition to the design team, and it wouldn't be like, oh, we'll just check off the ethics box. I mean, that couldn't be quite that simple, right? But that there would be this this full, like I say, much more robust analysis of this and try to go forward. So I would also recommend Batya Friedman's value design framework, because they look at values too, and not just moral values, but there can be non-moral values built into technological design. They're just what we call normative, as opposed to simply factual or descriptive. So I don't know if that answers your question. But
Yeah, sure. I was concerned about, for instance, an unknown technology born today, for example, can affect people behavior in the future. So I can't even imagine some kind of professional that can do these predictions in a good way. It's very difficult for me to understand how to put in a framework like you are proposing this predictive part of these new technologies, because they're changing every single time. So it's difficult for me to understand this predictive part of ethical issues. But sure.
yeah,
Thank you.
And I think the good thing is too that I know that many universities in the computer science programs in the U.S. do require software engineers to take some kind of ethical module or course or something. So at least it's raising awareness to that technology is not value free. It's not as if, oh, I'm just doing technology, I don't care about values, and it's not that way, because it's laden. Values are built into it, and I mean, there's stories about how the unintended consequences go. There was many years ago, there was in the United States in the New York area, there was a bridge that was supposed to be built from the city to over to some seashore area so people could go to recreate for vacations or whatever. And the bridge was designed in such a way that a bus would not fit under the beams of it. And what that meant was poor people that couldn't afford automobiles couldn't go. Now, no one sat down and said, we're going to discriminate against poor people. But it just turned out that wasn't taken into consideration in the design of it. Maybe it's a kind of a silly example, but I think or I used the example of cookies technology, which I mean has been a little bit controversial. No, I don't think when people developed the cookies technology, they were thinking, we'll try to invade users' privacy. I honestly believe it was for more honest reasons, like trying to keep a counter on websites and look at tracking and visitation. But just so ended up, maybe no one quite foresaw that because maybe the people that built it had no sensitivity to privacy or something like that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tavani, for your presentation. We have no more time for this. I'm sorry with the people that ask anything in YouTube channel, but we have finished this session at this moment. Dr. Tavani, thank you very much for being here, for accepting the invitation, and thank you for being here. Thanks everybody for accepting also the invitation for participating in the seminar.
Thank you.
Okay.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.